I was at a high school reunion a few weeks ago, standing near the punch bowl, when I ran into a guy I used to call my best friend. Back then, we were inseparable, two kids who shared every secret and swore we'd never change. But as we stood there, I felt like I was talking to a total stranger who just happened to be wearing his face. He was dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, obsessing over real estate yields and market volatility. I remember him as the boy who spent his afternoons sketching birds in the park and talking about the meaning of freedom. The most jarring part wasn't the clothes or the graying hair. It was his laugh. It was deeper, more calculated, lacking the wild, messy energy I remembered. When I brought up an old inside joke, he just smiled politely, a flicker of recognition crossing his face that felt more like a courtesy than a genuine memory. It was as if the person I knew had been hollowed out and replaced bit by this new, polished professional. Later that night, I went home and found an old, grainy Polaroid of us from senior year. I looked at my own face in the photo and felt a sudden, cold wave of vertigo. I realized that since that photo was taken, every single cell in my body, my skin, my blood, even the structure of my bones, had died and been replaced multiple times over. The me in that picture literally didn't exist anymore. Every atom had been swapped out for a new one. It made me think of an old puzzle that philosophers have been chewing on since ancient Greece. It's a story about a hero named Theseus and his legendary ship. As the ship sat in the harbor, its rotting planks were replaced one by one with new oak until not a single splinter of the original wood remained. If every piece is new, is it still the same ship? And, more importantly, if every piece of us has changed, our selves, our beliefs, our very souls, how can we possibly claim to be the same person we were yesterday?
It's an incredibly disorienting feeling, that sudden unmooring of the self, What you experience looking at that Polaroid is, well, it's perhaps the most profound cognitive friction we can experience as human beings.
Right, because we just walk through the world anchored by this invisible assumption. You go to sleep, you wake up, you look in the mirror, and you just assume the face looking back is the exact same biological entity that went to bed.
Exactly. But when we actually shine a light on the underlying biological truths, that intuitive assumption just completely falls apart.
Which brings us directly to the mission of today's deep dive. We're looking at this fascinating, honestly kind of terrifying stack of case studies today. We've got medical logs from a modern neurosurgical theater, architectural restoration manifestos from post-war Berlin,
ancient Greek philosophical texts.
Right, and even contemporary engineering reports on large language models and AI. And the goal for you, the listener, is to figure out one central question. What actually makes you, you? Is it the matter you're made of, or the story that connects the pieces? Because this relentless cellular replacement isn't just a fun fact.
It's an ongoing crisis of identity happening at a microscopic level inside you, every single second. And the most jarring realization of this isn't in abstract debates, but in high-stakes environments. Let's look at the medical documentation we have on a specific individual. We'll call him Elias.
Okay, Elias.
He's a high-precision neurosurgeon based in London, and his surgical career has spanned over 40 years.
And the details on Elias are wild because they frame this abstract problem as an immediate tactile crisis. Like, think about the specific sensory environment Elias operates in. It's engineered for absolute certainty.
Right, the scrub room.
Exactly. When he scrubs in, he's standing under these incredibly harsh clinical LED lights. There are no shadows. The air is aggressively filtered and smells sharply of chlorhexidine, that very specific chemical astringent smell. The water is temperature controlled to the exact decimal degree. Everything screams predictability.
But as Elias stands there, staring at his hands under that water, he's profoundly haunted by a physiological reality that defies all that clinical certainty. He knows, based on the very medical science he devoted his life to, that absolutely zero atoms in his fingertips today were present during his first solo operation back in 1986.
I really want you to pause and think about that. Not one atom. Zero. We vaguely know cells die, but the actual mechanics of this, it's not a slow fade. It's a violent microscopic demolition.
It is a total reconstruction project. The skin Elias is looking at, the layer about to stretch over the sterile latex of his gloves, that entire epidermal layer is completely replaced every 4 weeks.
Every 4 weeks? Same.
Yeah. At the base of the epidermis, the basal cells are constantly dividing. They push older cells upward. As those older cells move up, they undergo programmed death apoptosis. They flatten, lose their nuclei, and become packed with keratin,
forming the outer layer.
Exactly. And eventually, they just flake off into the environment as dust. So the literal surface of his hands, the physical boundary between him and the outside world, is a brand new biological shield every month.
but it goes deeper than the skin, right? Because for a neurosurgeon, the nerves are everything. He relies on tactile feedback measured in fractions of a milli.
The neurons themselves, the main cell bodies, might last a lifetime, but the internal components absolutely do not. The ion channels, the structural proteins, the lipid bilayers, they're all relentlessly degraded and synthesized anew.
Like swapping out parts on a Reading engine.
But even more dramatic is the structural foundation, the bones.
Yeah, actual finger bones.
Yeah.
I always thought of the skeleton as this permanent inert scaffolding, like steel beams.
Oh, completely wrong. Bone is highly active, living tissue. Inside Elias's finger bones, there's an endless microscopic war between osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So osteoclasts are like a microscopic demolition crew. They secrete acids that dissolve the solid calcium and phosphorus, carving tiny tunnels into the bone. Right behind them are the osteoblasts, the construction workers. They move into those pits and secrete new protein matrix, which crystallizes with new calcium from the bloodstream.
It's an active, endless construction site. I was reading that the entire human skeleton is basically dissolved and rebuilt from scratch every 10 years.
Right.
Which means, mathematically, over a 40-year career, Elias has had 4 entirely different skeletons inside his hands, 4 different sets of bone density. So he's basically operating a meat mech that he just moved into a few weeks ago.
That's a funny way to put it, but it's incredibly accurate to his cognitive friction. When he begins a procedure, when he feels that minute resistance of a meningioma tumor against his scalpel, he relies on muscle memory.
Right. He knows exactly how much pressure to apply.
But biologically, the muscles, skin, and bones holding that scalpel did not learn that skill. The hands he has right now have never seen the inside of a skull before.
Because the brain is sending commands down to end effectors that are basically newborns. It's like if I swap out 100% of my car's parts over 10 years, the engine, transmission, steering wheel, the DMV says it's the same car. But biologically, Elias has entirely new hands.
Right, the feeling of ownership is an illusion. Muscle memory lives in the motor cortex and the cerebellum, not the muscles. The brain writes a software program for cutting a tumor and transmits it to the hardware.
And this causes a huge psychological crisis for him. It's like running a flawless legacy software program on a computer where the motherboard and processor were secretly swapped out with a rogue IT department in the dark.
And the case notes mention that Elias feels this intense, quiet shame. If his hands tremble during a long operation, even just a tiny tremor from fatigue, he feels a crushing wave of inadequacy.
But it's not just a rational fear of the new cells failing, is it?
No, it's existential dread. He feels he's betraying a self that supposedly survived this total replacement. He feels responsible for these new cells. He's a ghost steering a ship rebuilt at sea, terrified the eye will slip through the floorboards.
Which establishes the absolute maximum cognitive friction. If his hands are entirely different matter, who is performing the surgery? But wait, we accept gradual change all the time. Society functions perfectly fine on the assumption that gradual replacement preserves identity. Why is our brain's default setting to ignore the material turnover and focus on the shape?
To understand that cognitive bias, we have to look at the historical origins of the problem. We need to leave modern London and travel back several millennia to ancient Greece.
Because they didn't use cells and bones, they used wood and iron. Think about the sensory shift here. Imagine the environment. You've got the warm Mediterranean wind blowing in.
It's carrying the sharp scent of sea salt mixed with crushed olives and dry dust.
And the sheer euphoria of an entire city in celebration. You're in the great harbor of Athens. And returning is Theseus, the legendary hero, returning from Crete after navigating the labyrinth and slaying the Minotaur.
And the focal point of this massive societal relief is his ship. This mighty vessel built with deep keels and heavy oak masts to slash through the violent agency. When it dropped anchor, it ceased to be a utilitarian object.
Right, it became a monument, a tangible symbol that evil could be defeated. So the city makes a pledge to keep the ship intact forever.
But time and the elements are enemies that cannot be slashed by a sword. The symbol is eternal, but the oak wood is absolutely not. The physics of decay are brutal here.
Yeah, you have the blistering Mediterranean sun baking the deck, UV radiation breaking down the lignin, causing the wood to splinter, winter rains soaking into the micro fissures.
And most destructively, the salt water. The agency is incredibly saline. Salt water permeates the wood. When it evaporates, microscopic salt crystals are left behind. They physically expand inside the pores, literally tearing the cellular walls apart from the inside. plus marine fungi and shipworms.
So preservation is just a desperate battle against entropy. A decade passes, a plank succumbs to rot, it grows dark and soft. The loyal Athenian carpenters arrive at the docks.
They pry out the oxidized iron nails, pull out the rotten wood that smells of damp earth, and nail in a new piece of oak. Fresh, strong, smelling of sweet sap.
And the critical phenomenon happens the next morning. The sun rises, the citizens look out, and it is still unequivocally the Ship of Theseus. No one doubts it. Their brains patch over the material change because the shape remains identical.
But the relentless march of time doesn't stop. The mainsail gets torn by the sea wind and is replaced with new woven cloth. The massive support mast cracks and is swapped out for a completely different tree trunk.
And this happens plank by plank, nail by nail. The process is so agonizingly slow that it goes entirely unnoticed by the people who see it every day. They are observing a static shape, completely blind to the total substitution of matter.
Until one day, hundreds of years later, some observant philosopher realizes a terrifying truth. Not a single centimeter of the ship's material is original. There isn't an iron nail left that was swept by the cold waves the night Theseus returned. Every inch is new material.
Which forces the question, is it still the Ship of Theseus? Does the truth of a thing lie in its physical material or in its shape and historical narrative?
Exactly. That is the core debate that has echoed across the ages.
But I'm not buying the slow replacement makes it okay argument. It feels like a magic trick of timing. Like, think about the phone you're listening to this deep dive on. If you shatter the screen and replace it, still your phone. Replace the battery, still your phone.
Right, the threshold problem.
Exactly. At what exact percentage does it cease to be yours? If I sneak down to the harbor and replace one rusty nail, it's the same ship. 50% in one night. People hesitate. What if I drop a 100% new replica in the harbor in the blink of an eye? People would riot and say, that's a fake. So why does doing it slowly over 100 years suddenly make the fake real?
Your skepticism is completely justified. The reason we accept the slow replacement is because it avoids triggering our brain's threat detection mechanisms regarding novelty. It perfectly mirrors our own biological reality, our slow aging.
Because if Elias had all his cells swapped out in a single flash of light, we'd view him as a clone, an imposter.
Exactly. We would be terrified of him. But because his cells die and regenerate over weeks and years, unnoticed in the background, we grant him the grace of continuity. Human psychology equates uninterrupted spatial and temporal history with unbroken identity. We assume as long as the shape holds steady, the soul remains inside.
Let's challenge that. Because there's a restoration architect in Berlin who would violently disagree with the idea that an unbroken silhouette equals identity. Let's move from a wooden ship to a concrete structure defined by its trauma.
This shifts the lens from continuous form to accumulated history. We have a fascinating case involving a woman named Clara, a senior restoration architect in modern-day Berlin.
And Berlin's the perfect setting for this. An entire city built, destroyed, divided, and rebuilt over a massive fault line of historical trauma.
Clara was tasked with healing a crumbling pre-war apartment block in the eastern part of the city. This structure bore the violent, visceral pockmarks of Soviet artillery from the Battle of Berlin in 1945. Heavy limestone walls physically scarred by shrapnel, bullet holes, and intense heat.
It stood as a silent witness for decades.
Right, but modern surveys deemed the facade structurally unstable. Her mandate from the city council was to replace every compromised structural element to ensure modern safety standards, essentially to create a flawless, safe replica from the ground up using new, reinforced materials.
Put yourself in Clara's environment. It's a freezing, damp Berlin morning. She's high up on metal scaffolding, wearing a hard hat, watching these old, soot-stained, bullet-pocked bricks being mechanically hauled away by heavy machinery.
Dumped into trucks, taken to a facility, and crushed into anonymous gravel for road foundations.
The air is thick with dust, tasting like chalk, pulverized mortar, and old fires. And as she watches this literal erasure of history, she commits a secret act of rebellion.
Yes, she reaches into the rubble conveyor belt, picks up a single jagged shard of original damaged limestone, one that clearly has the groove of a bullet strike on it, and hides it deep in her heavy coat pocket.
And that shard in her pocket represents the exact tension between two opposed views of identity. To the city planners, identity is purely conceptual. It's the silhouette on the skyline, the geometric dimensions, the legal address.
As long as the new building looked exactly like the old one and sat in the same GPS coordinates, they considered it the same building, just restored.
But Clara knows that's a lie. She feels the heavy weight of that jagged shard in her pocket. To her, Every single new, perfectly square, sterile brick she orders laid is an act of deception. She isn't restoring a piece of history. She is constructing a stage set.
Because the truth of the building, its actual essence, lived in the trauma of the scars she was being paid to erase. Clara realized identity is not a pristine original design. Identity is the accumulation of damage.
Yes, it's the physical record of what the material endured.
By making the building physically perfect, she was making it a stranger to its own history. The new building didn't survive the Battle of Berlin. It survived a factory casting process in 2023.
This realization hit me incredibly hard. Because if you abstract Clara's dilemma, you realize we do this exact same thing to our own minds. Think about the internal architecture of your own identity.
Connection.
Right. How often do we look back at our past selves? The naive version that got our heart broken, or the version that held beliefs we now find embarrassing. What do? We systematically haul away those old, soot-stained bricks of our personality. We engage in massive psychological renovation. We excise the naivety and patch our inner space with new understanding.
In psychology, this is known as memory reconsolidation and cognitive restructuring. We pull out emotional responses that are no longer adaptive. We actively suppress painful scars, literally pruning neural pathways associated with past traumas and reinforcing new ones.
But in doing so, are we just doing what the Berlin city planners did? Are we creating a sterile, perfectly safe replica of a person? If identity is the accumulation of damage, what happens when we heal all our psychological scars? Are we even the same person? Clara proves that once you strip away the original material and its specific history of pain, the soul becomes a hollow marketing brochure, a fake facade.
This brings us to the core dialectical contradiction. Is identity the material composition that holds the record of events, or the continuous historical shape we project onto it? Clara's rebellion is a desperate attempt to physically anchor the historical story. She refuses to accept the flawless building as real because it lacks the physical memory of the artillery shells. It has the shape, but it lacks the trauma.
And without the trauma, the continuity is an illusion. Which brings us to the most terrifying twist. Because what Clara did, symbolically saving one shard of philosopher named Thomas Hobbes, imagine doing on a massive scale. And when you scale Clara's rebellion up to 100%, our intuition completely shatters.
Yes, we must return to the ancient harbor of Athens. Hundreds of years after the original paradox was debated, the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes added a devastating addendum, the concept of the saved pieces.
Imagine the Ship of Theseus sitting in the sunlit harbor, having its rotting planks swapped out. But Hobbes says, imagine there is a sneaky, meticulous harbor guard with an obsession with original history. Every time a carpenter pulls out a rotting plank or a rusty nail and throws it on the scrap heap, this guard is watching.
And when the harbor is quiet, the guard gathers up the discarded pieces and secretly carries them away in a cart. He takes these rotting materials into a massive dark warehouse up in the hills, and he keeps them there for centuries. Every plank, every peg, cataloged and preserved.
The smell of that warehouse would be overwhelming. Centuries of damp, decaying oak, oxidizing iron, dried sea salt. It's a graveyard of parts. And then comes the monumental day when the ship in the harbor has its very last original piece replaced. The harbor ship is now entirely new materials, pristine, beautiful.
But on that exact same day, in the dark warehouse, the guard finishes his grand project. Over the years, he has taken every single piece of junk debris and painstakingly reassembled them, putting every piece back in its exact original place. He has formed a complete ship.
So now, the universe has a massive, logic-breaking problem. There are two ships existing simultaneously, and they both have a deeply compelling claim to the title of the Ship of Theseus.
We must contrast these two entities carefully. The first ship in the harbor is entirely new material, not a single atom of original wood. However, it holds the continuous narrative. The citizens have held festivals around it, projected their belief onto it. It possesses continuity of form and unbroken societal acceptance. Legally and culturally, it is the Ship of Theseus.
But then you walk up the hill into the warehouse, and there sits the second ship. It's rickety, rotten, looks like a strong breeze would collapse it. But, and this convinces me, it is made of 100% original materials. If you touch the deck, you are touching the exact carbon molecules Theseus stepped on. That wood vibrated with the hero's breath. It slashed through the Aegean Sea. I have to say, the ship in the harbor is just a beautifully crafted copy wearing a name tag. The warehouse ship is the actual truth.
I must disagree with your conclusion there, though I definitely understand the instinct. You are prioritizing material continuity over functional continuity. If we define a ship by its ability to sail and its integration into a society, The rotting pile of wood fails the test. Identity is a social contract. The harbor ship survived time through maintenance, like all living things. If you claim the warehouse ship is the true ship, you argue identity is a static snapshot of matter, divorced from time and function.
But if you choose the harbor ship, you're saying identity is just a software program, a shape poured into any material. You're saying Clara was wrong, and the fake Berlin building is real just because the planners say so. If physical matter doesn't matter, then Elias the neurosurgeon really is a completely different person than the one from 1986, and he has no right to his own memories. You literally cannot have it both ways. The sudden presence of the second ship forces a total crisis.
That is precisely why Hobbes' thought experiment is so devastating. It proves our concept of identity is fundamentally flawed because it relies on two pillars, material and narrative, that we assume will always stay together. When forced into competition, the brain cannot process two mutually exclusive truths simultaneously.
And this brings us to the final, most terrifying part of our deep dive. This isn't just a fun mind game for a philosophy classroom anymore. Technology has literally manifested the two ships thought experiment in human form, and the psychological consequences are devastating. We have to talk about what is happening right now at the intersection of neuroscience and AI.
The transition from theoretical wooden ships to contemporary human existence is abrupt and deeply unsettling. The most profound dimension emerges when the discarded pieces of a human life are actively reconstructed by modern engineering. Let us examine a specific modern tragedy unfolding in a family in San Francisco.
Let's look at this case study of a tech executive. His father, a brilliant academic, is succumbing to late-stage Alzheimer's, and we need to be clear about what this disease is. It's a brutal, agonizing process. It is literally the slow, piece-by-piece biological dismantling of a person's cognitive structure.
Neurologically, it is catastrophic. Abnormal levels of a naturally occurring protein clump together to form amyloid beta plaques between neurons. Simultaneously, neurofibrillary tangles made of tau protein accumulate inside the neurons, blocking the transport system. The neurons lose their ability to communicate, and then they undergo apoptosis. The brain tissue literally shrinks. The physical matter that stored his memories, the planks of his cognitive ship, are rotting and being pulled out, replaced by void.
In desperation, facing the complete erasure of the man he knew, the son turns to the technology he works with every day. He decides to act exactly like the sneaky harbor guard. He gathers his father's entire lifetime of digital archives, decades of voice memos, tens of thousands of emails, private digital journals, recorded lectures. He takes all these discarded pieces of his father's cognitive history and uses them as a massive training data set for an advanced large language model.
The son builds the warehouse ship in a server farm. He maps the data into a high-dimensional vector space. The neural network learns the exact probabilistic distribution of the father's vocabulary, his sentence structure, his emotional triggers, and his deeply held opinions. While the biological father is decaying in the real world, the son is in the dark warehouse of code, mathematically reassembling the father's persona.
And the result is that two versions of the man now exist simultaneously in the exact same house. Let's look at the original ship. The biological father sitting in the armchair, he is a shell. His synapses are failing. He can no longer remember his own son's name, let alone his own history. The physical vessel is present. The biological hardware is running, but the software has been permanently corrupted.
And then you have the reassembled ship, the AI residing in a sleek, glowing terminal on the son's desk. And the terrifying thing is the fidelity of this reconstruction. Because it was trained on the pure historical material of the father's life, it mimics him with haunting, flawless precision. It doesn't just sound like him. It has his exact wit. It can articulate the father's nuanced political grievances that the biological man hasn't spoken of for years. It possesses his encyclopedic love for obscure 1970s jazz and will actively argue about vinyl pressings using the father's exact rhetorical kits.
This creates a domestic Cold War of identity that induces profound ontological vertigo in the son. He finds himself doing the unthinkable, walking past the living room where his biological father sits in silence, to go into his office, boot up the terminal, and seek advice from the machine. And the guilt he feels is crushing.
The son is caught in an impossible contradiction. The direct parallel is painfully clear. The biological father sitting in the armchair has the legal biological right to the name. He is the original matter. He is the rotting ship in the warehouse, physically present but structurally collapsed. But the digital reconstruction holds the pure narrative essence. It is the ship in the harbor, operating flawlessly, holding the unbroken thread of the father's personality. The son is forced to mourn a person who is technically still breathing in the next room. He is mourning the loss of the narrative while the physical matter of his father is still warm.
It proves Hobbes' point in the most agonizing way imaginable. The old parts have been rebuilt into a new form that creates a vastly more convincing version of the father than the biological entity. For Elias, the neurosurgeon, his body changed while his mind stayed continuous. For the father in San Francisco, his body remains continuous while his mind has been extracted and placed elsewhere. This completely shatters our fundamental understanding of who someone is. When the shape and the matter are divorced so completely, our intuitive map of identity simply burns away. You cannot point to either the man in the chair or the voice in the computer and definitively say, "That is my father," without entirely compromising your definition of human existence.
Identity is neither a fixed, immovable physical anchor, nor is it an unbroken, ethereal soul floating cleanly above biology. It is a constantly shifting, deeply fragile negotiation between the physical matter that sustains a form and the historical stories that bind that form to the world. We are entirely rebuilt at sea. We are pieced together from discarded memories, from hidden architectural scars, and from newly minted cells. We are simultaneously the harbor guard's rotting, authentic replica hidden in the dark, and the pristine, functioning vessel cutting through the bright waves of the present moment.